Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Defending Life podcast, brought to you by the Quad-Parishes of Green Bay. I'm your host, Joseph, and I'll be your guide as we explore the vast topic of life. Now, I do want to mention where I'm recording, have a microphone and everything set up in the mother's or the crying room at St. Joe's Parish here in Green Bay, so hopefully that will explain inequality. Anyway, throughout this series now, it will cover, honestly, an exhaustive amount of information from every objection to the pro-life position, to a high-level look at embryology and genetics, to legal issues with Roe v. Wade. We'll look at, all of the death caused by in vitro fertilization, to the history of abortion. Now, the series has no political motive, only one of informative insight in line with modern science, the legal process, and the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And our goal is to show everyone listening that all lives have inherent value. So whether we're talking about a zygote, an immigrant, a conservative police officer, or a person of color, all people are created equal. Issue is, if I'm going to claim that people are created equal, I should probably begin with when a person is created. Because in the abortion debate, they claim that a human being is different from a person. Now, one thing I'd like to address is the fact that when I use terms such as like pro-choice or pro-life, I am not implying that the antithesis or the opposite of each phrase is true. So if I say someone is pro-life, I'm not saying that they are intentionally anti-choice. And if I say someone is pro-choice, I'm not saying that they're intentionally anti-life. We have to avoid a non-Christian judgmental vitriol, and just keep in mind that the words life and choice used here is just the subject of each side's focus. So, Ashley Montagu, he was a British anthropologist, and he claimed that race was a myth. And he stated, a newborn baby is not truly human until he or she is molded by cultural influences later. Some have focused on a mental criterion for personhood. For example, Dr. Joseph Fletcher, he argued that humans without some minimum of intelligence or mental capacity are not persons, no matter how many of their organs are active, no matter how spontaneous their living processes are. Now, not only is this an argument for infanticide, it's also a justification for euthanasia based on the criterion of a minimal IQ. Before we get too far ahead, looking at different criteria, let's first see why one is even needed. The Stanford Students for Life group, they supply a succinct, a very straightforward line of reasoning for the pro-life stance. And they use what's called a syllogism. It's basically a tool that's used in logic to arrive at a deduction. It's pretty simple. So an example could be premise 1, I love all rabbits. Premise 2, my pet Margie is a rabbit. And conclusion, therefore, I love Margie. So that makes sense, right? So the syllogism proposed by the Stanford group is as follows. It says, premise 1, deliberately targeting innocent persons for destruction should be illegal. Premise 2, unborn children are persons. Conclusion, deliberately targeting unborn children for destruction should be illegal. Now, of course, what we need to first prove is that premise 2 here, saying that unborn children are persons, we have to prove that to be true. And to do so, we're going to look at some philosophy and some science at an approachable level, and we're going to have to conclude that, that this must be right. Now, and they also have another very simple line of reasoning. They say, premise 1, to be a human being is sufficient to make one a person. Premise 2, embryos and fetuses are human beings from conception. Conclusion, unborn children are persons. It makes sense, but before we begin to define what a person is in the first place, I want to look at what an organism is. Now, in biological philosophy, any organism possesses inherent, they always have inner workings that strive for self-development. And I would argue that the functions of an organism are fine-tuned to work together to sustain its existence. And so we can use this model to say that a fish, for example, that's an organism, because it uses, it actually has, it's a mixture. It uses its forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, and brain stem to sustain its existence. However, a fish egg would not be an organism because it only acts as a carrier for the fish. So that makes sense, right? Now, you must ask, does this model apply to a human embryo as well? A 2006 pediatric research article, it notes that a simple zygote contains the organizing principle of the full development of that organism. So a zygote does contain those inner workings that work together to sustain existence. And now, as a zygote, not part of the mother anymore, because it possesses its own DNA and genetic code, it therefore possesses its own body. And this isn't an agenda-driven claim, it's simple embryology. And obviously when I say body, don't mean a fully grown, fully developed adult, a human adult body. I mean body as in what contains it, what contains its being. Now, pro-life advocates, they're always going to agree that a woman should have a choice over her body. All women should have a choice over their own bodies. But the issue is, a pro-life advocate, they'll also say, well, a woman should not have the choice they should not be able to choose death for a completely separate body. Because she can have a choice over her own body and what she does with it, what she allows with it, but she shouldn't have a choice over the distinctly separate body that just happens to depend on her, like a toddler does, for example. Now, of course, those of you who know me, I don't like to accept a conclusion based on one premise. So let's look at like a human adult. A human adult, if we trace, the development of that adult from an embryo into a fully developed adult, and we trace that back, right? So we go back from an adult all the way to the embryo itself, the most simple-celled aspect of this life. We see that nothing kickstarted this development until we reach a certain point in time, which was fertilization. And this fertilization event, it marks the moment when this new human being, the entire trajectory of their life, was completely coded into an entirely new genome. And this code that defines this path, it doesn't falter. So the life that, the human adult has lived, it was coded, or at least their interactions, their internal interactions have been coded at the moment of fertilization. Now, by this definition, we have to conclude that a human embryo is, like any other embryo, a self-organizing organism. But is it a person? Well, looking to Oxford Learner's Dictionary, we see that a person is simply a human as an individual. Okay, so I want to try to establish a line between who is and who isn't a person. Actually, we can see let's see what other people in history have maybe done. How about the European Jews from the 1930s to the 40s? They were called subhuman Untermensch, and actually, no, that didn't go too well for them. How about African kings? So African kings, they decided that the lives of their people and slaves from other countries, they were worth the same as guns or alcohol or human sacrifices, and they ended up beginning the Atlantic slave trade. That one didn't turn out too well either. We could look at early Americans who accepted these slaves and decided that they were worth the whole 3/5 of a vote. I don't like that one either. That's not a good distinction. Actually, more recent, the Tutsi tribesmen in the Rwandan genocide. They were called parasites, and we can't do that because almost 1 million of them were killed for that reason, because someone decided that they were not persons. And if all persons are not equally human, and we decide that we have the power to define humanity on a situational basis, then genocide will occur. And I get it. It may seem like I'm dancing around the establishment of marking personhood, but just wait. It'll all come together. I do want to say, for the most part, I am going to avoid the subject of ontology. It's the study of being. It gets into the ideas of people like Aristotle, Heidegger, Van Inwagen, etc. So I'm just going to focus on biological personhood. Now, to do so, we can show this by establishing a minimum set of characteristics that must exist for an organism to be a person. So we just have to, put forward a couple criteria that will mark what makes one a person. And in history, in American history, many other people have realized why this is such an important thing to do. When the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision was drafted, Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun, he realized that, and I quote, "If this suggestion of personhood is established, the appellant," now in this case the appellant was Norma McCorvey, Roe, and an appellant is someone who appeals to a higher court to reverse the decision of a lower one. So he said, if this suggestion of personhood is established, the appellant's case collapses, for the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment states that no state shall deprive any person of life without due process of law, and that no state will deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So if an unborn fetus is declared a person, again, the 14th Amendment, any person within a state's jurisdiction will not be denied the equal protection of the laws. So that's why it was so important, because they had to redefine what makes one a person. And even Justice Blackmun's law clerk, he agreed with the illogicality of the decision, and he noted that it was one of the most intellectually suspect constitutional decisions of the modern era. And other justices, such as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, have said that Roe ventured too far in the change it ordered and presented an incomplete justification for its action. Now, side note, I will say that yes, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her focus was more on the legality of abortion rather than what makes a person, but that's a whole separate episode, I'm sure. Now, as we know that an organism is built towards survivability, we can say that self-organization is one criterion, if and only if the organism is a member of the human species. We can also add that an organism must be a living human being to be a person. So human organisms, they begin at fertilization, as we noted. So they already fulfill the criteria given thus far. So living, and we'll look at if they're living, but so living, they have to have self-organization, and they must be a human organism. Alright. But some people who are pro-choice, they'll stop you right here. They'll say that we need another property to mark personhood. Because, if a fetus does have personhood, well, then it has basic dignity and value. And if someone is going to say that they are pro-choice, but also say that other lives matter, that all lives matter, then of course they'll be going against it. So they have to take away that personhood. And understandably, at least in their position, logically that makes sense. In order to reach that position, you have to redefine it. You have to move the goalposts. Because we can't just say that a being is not a person just because we said so. Because we see what happens when we do that. Now, the criteria that have been proposed by advocates of the pro-choice stance, they can be broken into one of two groups: continuous and binary properties. Continuous properties, they include dependence and mental activity. So like awareness, consciousness, cognitive capability, things like that. Continuous properties, though, are those that vary by degree. One person can have more cognitive capacity than another. One person can be more aware than another. Binary properties may include having detectable brain waves, or could include, having desires. Binary properties, the desires one, it's kind of iffy, but a binary property, it's binary. Either it exists, or it does not exist. Now, if someone proposes a criterion that's continuous, it creates an issue. If criteria can fluctuate by person, then personhood can also fluctuate. And if personhood is able to fluctuate, then back in the time of the slave trade, the whole 3/5 of a person vote, well then, that would be valid if personhood can fluctuate. But it cannot. And considering every possible internal and external factor that we may encounter or possess, we all have what is called intrinsic value. Now, it's different from societal value. Societal value, it says that, for example, a man developing a cure for leukemia, his societal value would be greater than the societal value of a blind homeless man. However, intrinsic value puts them at the same level. It does not say one is greater than or lesser than the other. The writer, Mary Ann Warren, she stated that a right to live, it exists when a human life form possesses consciousness and the ability to feel pain, the ability to reason, is able to achieve a self-motivated activity, can communicate, and possesses self-consciousness. And as a result, she justifies abortions because she says the fetus does not meet these criteria. That's an issue, because these are all continuous properties. It's true that a newborn has much less cognitive capability than a neuroscientist. We can agree that a fetus is a lot less self-aware than, say, like an epistemological philosopher. The issue here, maybe you can see it, because it's apparent when we look at adults with the same limits. And someone who did that is Dr. Diane Irving, bench research biochemist and biologist with the National Institutes of Health. And she asks, and I quote, "What would this mean for the following list of adult human beings with diminished rational attributes? The mentally ill, the mentally handicapped, the depressed elderly, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's patients, drug addicts, alcoholics, and for those with diminished sentience, such as the comatose, patients in a vegetative state, paraplegics and other paralyzed and disabled patients, diabetics, or other patients with nerve or brain damage, would they be considered as only human beings but not also as human persons? Would that mean that they would not have the same ethical and legal rights and protections as those adult human beings who are considered as persons? Is there really such a split between a human being and a human person?" End of quote. So, people that she listed, I'm sure that anyone listening, you yourself or someone you know, has dealt with or is dealing with any of the things. So if you know someone who is mentally ill, if you know someone who is elderly and depressed, someone who is an alcoholic, someone who has diabetes, well, guess what? According to the continuous properties of Marianne Warren, they are not persons. They're human beings, they're bodies, but they're not people. They don't deserve rights. And sadly, bioethicists such as the animal rights philosopher Peter Singer. Now, I'll pause and say he's the director of the Center for Human Values at Princeton University. And somehow, I'm not sure how that's possible based on what I'm about to say. Because he says that higher primates, such as dogs, pigs, monkeys, they are persons. But some human beings, such as normal human infants and disabled human adults, are not persons. And remember, this is the guy, director of the Center for Human Values. So that's saying a lot. There's another bioethicist, his name is Norman Faust, considers cognitively impaired adult human beings, he just says that they're brain dead. So, someone with, just Down syndrome, they're an adult human being, they're brain dead. They can make no logical, valid decisions. They can have no ideas. They can contribute nothing. There's another bioethicist, R.G. Frey, and he published that many of the adult human beings from that list that I shared above from Diane Irving, he said that they are not persons, and instead says that they should be substituted for the higher primates who are persons in purely destructive experimental research. So, someone who's diabetic, they should replace the the monkey that's being used in a lab experiment. Or, if instead of cutting open a dog, just cut open the depressed grandmother. Because, as he said, purely destructive experimental research. And so I ask, why don't we just pull the plug on these individuals? They're not people, unless they are. And unless continuous properties don't work. Thus, we must look at objective and empirical criteria for personhood. And personhood, it must have a binary beginning. We have to select a single moment between a person and a non-person. It's like being able to live on one's own. It's a criteria, but it's definitely not a single moment in time. Brain activity, that doesn't work either, because it's detectable around 7 weeks, but how about the development? The development of the brain doesn't stop until around the age of 25. And in fact, the brain triples in weight between birth and 16 years. And most developmental changes, they're not completed until someone's 25 years old. So, a common suggestion for determining personhood is the moment of birth. Because at this moment, a fetus, supposedly, they transition from an organism to a person. Okay, so its rights are said to be non-existent before this moment, and apparently it has complete rights to life after this moment. Now, the moment of birth, it could work as a criterion if there was any biological difference between being in one place versus another. Let me explain. Birth, it's a wonderful moment in time, but honestly, all that's changed is the baby's environment. And an external condition cannot be relevant to one's inherent value. Just because their body happens to be in a different place now doesn't mean that they suddenly have value. And if someone won't let up on this line of thinking, I mean, they're saying that time has external control over human rights. And if you encounter this argument, ask the other person, ask them to present a solid, sound example of when time alone effected a human right. Not a legal privilege like buying cigarettes, because, of course, once you reach a certain age, you can then have certain legal privileges, but basic human rights don't come with age. And the right that's being called into question here, it's simply the right of the fetus's person to not be murdered. It's not a right that comes with age or with time. It's not continuous, because the right to one's life, it doesn't vary by degrees. And for Catholics, now this applies to people on death row as well, because no one is deserving of unjustified death. And when I say justified, I just mean the just war theory in theology, but that's a completely separate thing. Now, I want to look at another suggestion for a criterion, which is breathing on one's own or autonomously. This marker, it would also place the initial boundary of personhood at the time of birth. So while, birth, it does affect the baby's independence, since, breathing is no longer facilitated by the mother's body, there's nothing new about this step, because the fetus was exchanging gases before birth, just without the activation of his or her lungs. And now, if we make this a criterion, we encounter a problem. Elderly people, they become increasingly dependent as they age, and many revert to the dependency of a fetus as they near their hundreds. A lot of them, they're put on respirators when, like a fetus, they cannot mediate this gas exchange by themselves, but they don't cease to be persons. Now, someone can say, well, the criterion, it's just when they begin to breathe, because yes, an elderly person at one point, they began to breathe. However, a continuous property, if personhood can begin, then personhood must end. And if the marker for that personhood begins when breathing begins, then it must end when breathing ends. Now, another potential criterion that can cause some confusion, depending on the semantics of the phrase, is the ability to have desires. A conscious desire could be defined as a desire in which a physical object or event is pictured by a child and then fulfilled by a child's actions. So maybe like a baby they want to go a couple steps forward, so they think about it, not fully think, but so it's pictured in a way, and then it is carried out. They crawl forward. Okay, that could be a conscious desire, we could say. But what about a 5-year-old, completely brain dead, thus unable to have a conscious desire? Do we just take the life of that 5-year-old? Why even 5? How about a 20-year-old, completely brain dead, unable to have conscious desire? Do we take that life? Because it's not a person. Now, remember, we can't use that. Actually, and never mind. I was going to say something, but we can't go with a conscious desire. So how about just the innate, internally built urge to survive? I would say fine. That can also be a property, because remember, an organism is that which possesses the organizing principle of the full development of the organism's life. And in that case, then, yes, a zygote fulfills that desire because it is built to survive. But at the same time, there's no clear threshold that determines when a developing human being turns into a person with a mental desire. I'm going back to the conscious desire aspect, because we can't say it's the moment of self-awareness, because that would exclude newborn babies entirely. If you've ever interacted with a baby and you notice, like, one day they realize that they have like a foot or they have like a tongue, dude, that is the greatest moment of their life. They will play with their foot for hours. They will flick their tongue around. They love it. They're having so much fun. But they're definitely not fully conscious of everything that they possess. Now, if we cast like a wider net and we propose consciousness as a criterion, we have to define it. To save you some time, I'll let you know we can't define such a subjective property in a philosophical way. In a class that I taught last year, we looked at the fact that consciousness, it's incredibly hard to pinpoint, and I taught that we can recognize the existence of consciousness when we look at ideas such as the centipede's dilemma, for example. It's a poem, and it goes like this: a centipede was happy quite until a toad in fun said, "Pray, which leg comes after which threw her mind in such a pitch, she laid bewildered in the ditch, considering how to run." I'm sure some of you have, had that, where just you're walking and then you're conscious of how you're walking, and you're thinking like, oh, am I doing it right? You question such a simple motor skill. And then at the end of this poem, it says, "She laid bewildered in the ditch, considering how to run." So we can certainly consider overthinking and hyper-awareness as being conscious. Now, another neurophilosophical argument It's called the subjective epistemological problem. The subjective epistemological problem, it recognizes that the experience of consciousness, it's unique to each person. And it makes sense. Everyone doesn't see the color blue the same way. And you can listen to a song, get a certain experience from it, and then you can show that to a friend, and they're not going to get the same experience, and you don't know what they will experience. They can try to tell you, but they can only tell you so much. So all this has just been to say we can't do philosophical. We can't go philosophical route. Let's look at biological consciousness. So we can't say that a zygote isn't a person because it's still in the process of developing self-awareness, because someone who has been in a coma for months, well, they're also not sentient, and they often need months to develop self-awareness. And what about brain waves? Well, the first brain activities, they're seen after about the 7th week. But at the same time, the things which cause these brain waves are neurons, and they develop much earlier, and it's hard to exactly pinpoint when and how, when they develop. So there's no universal marker that says when these appear for everyone, and so even neurons can't be a valid criterion. How about this? How about viability? Now, viability, it is the ability to survive outside of the mother's womb. The thing is, though, that it varies as well. The youngest premature child to ever survive, her name was Lila Stensrud. This was in 2014. She was born 21 weeks, 4 days. I actually saw a picture of her yesterday, and she's still going strong. Looks super happy. So 21 weeks and 4 days. Wow, that's amazing. But someone could argue that once a baby is born, maybe they have to pass a period of time before they earn personhood. Which, saying that you have to earn it, and that's rough. That's bad by itself, but let's go with it. So, Dr. Francis Crick, he proposed the double helix DNA structure, and he suggested in the journal Nature that if a child were considered to be legally born when 2 days old, it could be examined to see whether it was an acceptable member of human society. So, his stipulation, it's even more strict. So once you're born, you're not a person. Once you're 2 days old, still not a person. You'll be examined, and if you have a deformity, well, then unfortunately you're not a person. And I don't think that can work, or that would work for anyone listening. Now, another issue is the fact that the age at which a fetus it could survive outside the womb, it only regresses as medical progress is made. So we can't say 6 months, because that's very much subject to change. And again, the value of a person cannot change based on an external factor. A final suggestion that I'll go over for a continuous property is that of the child's first movement. Well, this definitely can't work, because regarding internal movement, well, the cardiovascular system of a child, it's functioning in the 3rd week after fertilization, and at about 22 days or so after conception, the child's blood, which again it's unique to his or her own body, it begins to circulate. And at about 6 weeks, the child, they have formed eyes, a nose, a mouth, a tongue, and they can physically arch their back and their neck. Now, to use something that's called a born person analogy, and it's a good tool for anyone listening if you're ever in a friendly debate. A born person analogy, it's, you take the same stipulations and criteria that a pro-choice advocate may use, and you apply them to a hypothetical adult human being or someone who has been already born. So a born person analogy for the first movement is an adult, let's say they are a quadruple amputee. Actually, you know what, let's say completely paralyzed too. So unable to move, and they don't even have limbs. Are they less of a person? Again, I'm thinking not. Now, I'm going to briefly touch on something called the argument of potentiality. What that basically says is we're unable to argue for the legal rights of a person if that person will not or cannot exist. I'm not going to go too much into it, but I bring it up just to say, we also cannot prevent a life. We cannot take a life simply because a human being, they will potentially suffer. We can't play God and believe that whatever intrinsic goods this child will encounter, the intrinsic goods do not outweigh the intrinsic evils. So we can't say we need to take this life because we need, it's a harsh world out there. How could you bring a child into such an evil world? And it goes against something called actualist comparativism, and you don't have to worry about it. Anyway, so just want to bring that up, that no, it's not logically valid, no matter how much someone tries to convince themselves to prevent a life based on what may or may not happen. So I'm going to get to this part now. What is a strong list of criteria that makes one a person? As a Catholic, I would simply say having a soul. Because the Catechism of the Catholic Church says that the Church teaches that every spiritual soul is created immediately by God at conception. Okay, so conception occurs, a new organism occurs, a soul is then created. Now, Jane English, she's a physicist, and she founded something called the friendship theory, and she proposed 5 groups of characteristics needed for one to be a person. And the groups are the biological, so, being a human being would be one, eating, sleeping, things like that. Psychological, which is, perception, having emotions, being able to communicate, things like that. She suggests the rational group as well, so the ability to reason, to learn from experience. She mentions the social group. Social group is just experiencing sympathy, experiencing love. And then finally, the legal group. So to be a citizen, to have legal rights. However, she notes that one does not need to meet all 5 groups to be considered a person. If so, then many adults wouldn't meet these criteria either. A paraplegic doesn't have extremities. Someone with an extreme case of schizophrenia doesn't have rationality. A foreigner, they don't have citizenship. Someone who's again, to use this term, and I know it's not medically accurate, but I will say I'm not sure of the correct medical terminology, but someone who is brain dead, they don't have sympathy, or they're not able to act on sympathy. However, an unborn child does meet some of these criteria and thus would be considered a person. So, earlier, I shared a syllogism. It stated that, again, premise 1, to be a human being is sufficient to make one a person. Premise 2, embryos and fetuses are human beings from conception. Conclusion, unborn children are persons. And while we'll be certainly exploring the scientific part of this argument in a future episode, I want to briefly look at premise 2 real quick, that embryos are human beings from conception. So there's an objection that it's not used too much. It's mostly used by people who are just very uninformed, that the fetus is just a part of the mother. Because the my body, my choice, essentially saying the baby is a part of my body. Well, if that were the case, first of all, the mother would then have multiple pairs of eyes, possibly male genitalia. She had 10 more fingers. But as I noted before, a developing embryo has completely different genes than the mother. And if it were a part of her body, the genetic structure, it would be the same. But it's not. A human being, they have 46, sometimes 47 chromosomes. Sperm and egg have 23. And a geneticist, they can distinguish between the chromosomes, the DNA of an embryo, and that of the egg from which the embryo came. But that same geneticist, they could not distinguish between the DNA of an embryo and the adult human being version of that embryo. It's the exact same structure. Because this DNA makeup, it includes the code, essentially, that it determines the child's hair color, eye color, personality traits, etc. But I digress. So after addressing all these properties, I want to define one final binary property. A single moment that happens for all human beings and doesn't vary by degree. Now, one of the most learned individuals in the field of embryology, he's Professor Emeritus in the Department of Human Anatomy and Cell Science at Manitoba. His name is Dr. T.V.N. Prasad. And he stated the earliest human embryo is biologically alive. It fulfills the 4 criteria needed to establish biological life: metabolism, growth, reaction to stimuli, and reproduction. And when does this happen for everyone? At the moment of fertilization. Now, fertilization it's a gradual process, so how can it mark personhood? Well, it's a gradual process that has a set beginning in time. It is a gradual process, but it must begin at a set point. Someone might say, well, what about a cloned human? They weren't fertilized, so fertilization can't be the beginning of personhood for that person, right? Well, for that organism, right? And that, well, no, we use fertilization as a binary condition because it's almost always used to start a human's development. However, if fertilization did not occur, we still have the other criteria. The important one being a living human organism exists, and therefore personhood also exists. So if fertilization happens through an artificial way, personhood does not, it's not diminished. A last objection, what about monozygotic twins? Because in this case, 2 persons come from one fertilization, so can it work? Now, in the case of monozygotic twinning, a single fertilization event produces a single blastula, which it's a hollow ball of cells, and it follows the morula and zygote stages. And a piece of that one blastula could break off and grow as a separate individual. So as the monozygotic, because one zygote, as the monozygotic twins both came from the blastula that came from that one fertilization event, therefore they both possess personhood. So let's go over that first syllogism from this episode. Premise 1. Deliberately targeting innocent persons for destruction should be illegal. Premise 2. Unborn children are persons. Conclusion. Deliberately targeting unborn children for destruction should be illegal. And the end. That's it. There you have the pro-life stance regarding abortion. So obviously, there are many other parts of life, but we'll get to those eventually. Now, a brief note. In a future episode, I'd like to address the obligations that Catholics have when voting. And now remember, at the Quad-Parishes, we are a 501c3 organization, so we are not specifying names, candidates, political parties, anything like that. We're not saying just a presidential election, just a congressional election, local, anything like that. Just voting in general. So, I just want to note a few key points for now. Pope St. John Paul the Great, he said, in the case of an intrinsically unjust law, such as a law permitting abortion or euthanasia, it is never licit, it is never okay to obey it, or to take part in a propaganda campaign in favor of such a law or vote for it. And the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops stated that all issues do not carry the same moral weight, and that the moral obligation to oppose policies promoting intrinsically evil acts has a special claim on our consciences and our actions. And if we want to remain in communion with the Church, we must protect those who cannot protect themselves. Now, in closing, I'd like to end each episode with some examples of questions that you could maybe use if you were to ever get into a debate, or if you listening are of the pro-choice mentality, which is, that obviously that's your right. You could even ask yourself these questions. So the first one that you can ask is just, what would you say are the criteria for being a person? Easy enough. You can also use a born person analogy. You can, for example, let's say there's a woman and unfortunately she is raped and she conceives a child. However, let's say she decides to carry the child to term. And so maybe she must keep that child. She's unable to give the child up for adoption, and she decides to raise him until he's about, we'll say, like 7 years old, okay? Eventually, though, hypothetically, she decides that he is too painful a reminder of that horrific rape, and she just suffocates him to death. Was it fair in the first place for her to have to raise him? Using a broad definition of the word fair, no. Very broad definition, no. But was it acceptable for her to kill him? Because we've already shown that, well, he was a person before and after birth, so why does it matter when he's killed? Another analogy. If you lived until you were, let's say 18, that's usually the age that you can legally make choices for yourself in most states. Let's say you lived until you're 18 with a vegetative conjoined twin that would be able to live successfully if surgically separated from you, albeit dependent on your constant assistance. Would it be morally wrong to just kill your twin instead of getting that surgery? Because all you'd be left with is guilt at that point. So 18 years old, you could just kill the twin. It'll be a bit easier on you. But is it morally right or wrong? Another question. Could you say that a seed from a tree is not a plant. All organisms create offspring of some form. An acorn has the same DNA as an oak, and it contains chemicals called, what are they called? Polyphenols, one of which it's called tannic acid, and it's found in virtually all plant families. So thus, a seed must be a plant. Likewise, if someone admits that a seed from a tree is a plant, then they have to admit that an embryo is a human being. Now, I will just say, please check out our description below on this video, on this clip. There are going to be some good resources for if you yourself or someone you may know is dealing with abortion in any regard. And for those who are listening who are pro-life, keep in mind that all lives are equal, that we do not judge anyone. If you're a woman who has dealt with or might be dealing with the reality of an abortion, because I believe, 1 in 3 women before the age of 45 will experience one. If you're one of those, please know that at the Quad-Parishes of Green Bay, you are loved. Please know that I pray for you. I don't even know if you exist, but I pray for you. And I recommend that everyone listening keep listening to our future episodes. So, as I said though, everyone please check out the resources that we have below. And from everyone at the Quad-Parishes, blessings to you all. You are all loved, and talk to you next time. Again, I'm your host, Joseph, and keep praying for you. Thank you.